The next speaker on our program is going to be a very factual individual. We've just heard a very imaginative individual. Now we are turning to good, hard facts. There is probably no one in this country who has done more intensive, extensive, and successful research on the Communist Front affiliation of various prominent members of the community than has this speaker. He has published more on the subject than anyone else, and his record is tremendous. And I can commend him to you as being a man very concerned with accuracy and facts with no imagination supplied. So it was great pleasure that I present to you Mr. Myers Lowman of the Circuit Riders, who has come from Ohio to speak to us today.
Mr. Chairman, fellow Americans, if you have in your hand or in your pocket one of the programs, will you please change my address from Cleveland, Ohio to Cincinnati, Ohio? You will help reduce the deficit in the post office department because I do not live in Cleveland. As I sat in this room last night and listened to Mrs. McKinney go through in detail the arrangements and the work preceding this meeting, I could not help but think that a tape recording of her recital of what had happened to make this meeting possible would be the biggest morale boost that could be injected into the various movements throughout the country if this tape recording should be made and made available to the patriotic societies. Now, I urge upon you that you speak to Mrs. McKinney and her chairman and intercede with her chairman to be sure that she does make this recording. That would be probably the most important speech that came out of this meeting, because the American Martha and Joseph and John across the country needs some know-how on how to do this psychological warfare battle. I want to make it unmistakably clear that there should be no assumption that any person to whom I'm going to make reference is a communist or a pro-communist unless I said so. Stick to the strict text of what I say in our publications when quoting us. It matters little whether a person lends his name and the dignity and respectability of his position or office to a communist cause on a witting or an unwitting or a half-witted basis, insofar as the security of our nation is concerned. X number of thousands of persons aiding pro-communist or pro-communist causes damage this country, and whether it is done wittingly or unwittingly is of little importance to the security of our nation. It is something like the person who goes to a fire in response to a general alarm or seeing the equipment go to a fire, and in his excitement he picks up a bottle or a bucket or a container of a clear liquid and throws it on the fire, and the immediate response is whoosh. It doesn't make any difference whether the man throwing the clear liquid knew it was water or gasoline. If it was gasoline, the firemen have just as much trouble had the man known it was gasoline. Because of the late schedule, that we are running behind time, I am not going to repeat any of the names, Boston and New England names, that were given in the May Day anti-communist rally when I spoke here in 1960. But I am going to identify the names of many Boston and New England educators and clergymen and other professional persons with having given witting or unwitting aid to the Communist Party through the appearance of their name in support of communist causes in public print. It would be important, I think, for those of you who are actively engaged in anti-socialism, anti-collectivism, and anti-communism to make notes of 5 words that I'm going to give now. These 5 words are the 5 principal features of psychological warfare as taught in a 3-year course in the Lenin School of Political Warfare to many thousands of American and other communist functionaries around the world. After taking the communist training in their own locality, their national party training, and then going to Moscow for 3 years, these persons learned how to do 5 things, and it took them 3 years to learn how to do them successfully. And the learning of how to do these things, 5 things successfully, has made the communist conspiracy to conquer the world the greatest success story in the history of man, second only to the Jesus story and the life and works of Jesus. And then for this reason I say, it is important that whether you are in a sewing circle or a PT&A, or whether you are in a labor union, a church organization, a political organization, or whatever it might be, or whether you want to change the destiny of a nation, you learn how to do these 5 things, and you will succeed. The first principal feature of the communist psychological warfare is frontal assault. Frontal assault. The second feature is to infiltrate. Infiltrate. We'll come back and touch these lightly because we haven't time to go over them thoroughly. The third is to divide. Divide. The fourth is to organize this division that you have created. And the fifth is to decide. Decide whether to operate or disintegrate this apparatus. In 1929, the tactics of the Reverend Dr. Harry F. Ward, then of the Boston Seminary, the tactics of infiltrating American religion and education, as outlined by Harry Ward in his conferences with Stalin and others over a period of months in Moscow and elsewhere, became curriculum in the Lenin School of Political Warfare. Boston has been not only the cradle of America, but because of it being a port and an intellectual center, and because of the communist great affinity for emotion and history, because this was the cradle of America, it was also picked out early as an area which must be colonized on the takeover by the communist apparatus. Now, coming back to our 5, the 5 things. Frontal assault to America came this way. The communists, starting in the 1919 and 20 and for the next couple of years, made their frontal assault to the American worker, the peasant as they called him, by saying, we are communists, we are socialists, we are atheists, you join with us, help us, and we will tear up the existing order here. You will become the owners of everything, and you will be the government. By the mid-1920s, the American communists, most of them, saw that this was not what they wanted. They saw this was merely a fraud, and then the communists decided they had to infiltrate. And it took some 2.5 years of deep concentration on the techniques of infiltrating American church and education. And the communists in the mid-1920s said, if we are going to take America, we must remove the superstitions of religion. As long as X number of millions of Americans believe in God and the United States and would die for either or both, we will never have the means of going over there and taking that country physically. We must infiltrate and take this from within. Now, the reason it has been so difficult for the communists to take us from within is this. in the main. Until recent years, the biggest emphasis in the American home, the American church, and American school and government, the deepest emphasis was on spiritual, moral, and patriotic determination. And those three emphases, along with divine guidance and a lot of hard work, made this the greatest freedom of choice opportunity ever available to a large group of persons in the history of the world. There has never been anything to match the American freedom of choice system. You can be a Christian tomorrow or an atheist and back to a Christian. You can be wealthy or a bum. You can be anything in America you want as often as you want, hard enough and work hard enough to become that. The big difficulty in America today is that the American home, the American school, and the American church, to a large extent, have lost their way on the spiritual, moral, and patriotic determination emphasis, as did Rome and Greece and other advanced countries who lost their way and fell. And the history of the first 60 years of this century gives plenty index as to where we might be heading. It would appear that unless we reverse some of these trends, we are headed towards the garbage can of history as a people and as a nation. Now, for specifics, you knew there was a danger to your republic, to your home, your church, or your school, or you wouldn't have come here today. So let's talk about who did what, where, when, and how, and where you might read about it in support of a wide range of causes. We will take 5 of them and then tell you where you can read who did what. In the main, we're talking here in this part of the program about the militant pacifist organizations and projects whose objectives aid and abet wittingly or unwittingly the Soviet apparatus. One world groups which are dedicated to the drastic abridgment or destruction of the sovereignty of the United States and its ability to defend itself against the communist threat. And the third type or category are the socialist organizations and group projects which openly agitate in defense of communist and communist causes. I'm not talking about simple socialism there. I'm talking about the socialists who will die or who will fight for their pacifism and their socialism. And then we're talking about the Popular Front type of action and organization in which communists, socialists, one-worlders, and pacifists openly work as a leftist coalition against the interests and security of the United States. And fifth, the Communist Front organizations, publications, petitions, and other projects which have been adjudged subversive by the agencies of the government. Those are, in the main, the 5 categories of organizations to which we will make reference in the publications. I should like to stop for just a minute to pay deep respect and public admiration, make public admiration in the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, the most trusted American and this is one of the great points. This illustrates this respect and reputation and love that the American people have for J. Edgar Hoover is probably one of the greatest illustrations as to why a republic like ours is such a wonderful freedom of choice of system under which to live. This man heads our internal security police system. In the socialist countries, the collectivist countries, the man who heads the internal security police system is the most feared, despised, and hated man in the country. Let's hope we can preserve the integrity and the autonomy of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now we shall talk for a minute about the supreme bid for power. How many minutes have I, sir? The supreme bid for power threw a front in the first 25 years of the Communist Party's history of the United States was the National Citizens Political Action Committee, announced by a special committee on un-American activities in Washington in 1944 as the supreme bid for power. 83% of the members had records of affiliation with communist or communist front organizations, and I will say without reservation that many of them were identified communists. Who were these 144 persons? Which among them came from the Boston area? We had an Albert Sprague Coolidge, professor at Harvard University. I believe that's in Massachusetts. We had one Zara DuPont from Cambridge. Thomas H. Eliot, an attorney at Cambridge. John Kenneth Galbraith. William Nelson, Falls Village, Connecticut, and Liston Pope of the Yale Divinity School, and Alan Sweezy, professor of economics, Williams College, Massachusetts. I will caution the gentlemen and ladies of the press to quote me accurately. There is an ample tape recording process of every word and syllable, and I will be very grateful if I am quoted correctly and not out of context. I should like to make a quick reference to some of the demonstrating organizations at our doors today. I am as grateful to them as I am to Mrs. McKinney, this chairman, and all of those who work so hard. You got the local publicity for the God and Freedom meeting. These stupid punks got us wire service publicity. Thank you very much for being so stupid. The conservative movement in the United States cannot get wire service. It is only with the assistance and the stupidity of some of these groups who speak in the name of such groups as NAACP, CORE, and a number of others. Now, I want to speak, since I read the NAACP signs, I want to make myself clear on that. I do not represent that it is a communist organization, but I would like to give you a little background if you are one of the picketers or within range of my voice or by one of the tape recordings of what I'm saying. I would like to fill you in on the history of your organization and that part that might have been performed before you were old enough to say NAACP. You were saying Dada in those days. In 1928, there was a Sixth World Congress of the Communist Party International in Moscow. And in the same year, the Communist Garland Fund, the American Service Fund, a Harvard man's and students' inheritance, gave $100,000 in one check to the NAACP, 1928, the same year. The communists owned and operated the fund. Ben Gitlow, who was later the secretary of the Communist Party, or around at that time was one of the directors or trustees. And I learned much about this from Ben Gitlow. Ever since that $100,000 and the year 1928 when it was given to the NAACP, there has been a fight inside of the NAACP for control. The commies have been trying to take it over, but they have never taken it over. They have had great influence. They've had greater influence in some areas and districts, but it is not a communist organization. But I would observe that it would be difficult to find a mass membership organization in the United States that has been much more seriously infiltrated than the NAACP. 146 of its 235 officers, national committee members, and board members, as of 1957, had pro-communist and communist front records which have been published in a hearing in Florida in 1958. I would like to know, and if some of you can learn, will you mail to me 110 Government Place, Cincinnati 2, Ohio, the name of one anti-communist leader in the NAACP movement, or in the Students' Nonviolent Movement, or any liberal movement? Where is the anti-communist movement in the liberal movement? There isn't any identified anti-communist, organized anti-communist movement in the whole left of center. If you learn of one, I would like to know so I could make a retraction. Now for Boston names. I am not inferring that any one of these persons is a socialist, a communist, wittingly or unwittingly or half-wittingly loaned his name to this position. I am saying only that here is a petition of one of the groups undertaking to get Carl Braden and Frank Wilkinson, two persons identified in public hearings as communists, who are then in the penitentiary. There was an attempt to get these men out of the federal penitentiary. The petition is addressed to President Kennedy. There is a copy here for the press. Another of the initiating persons, in other words, the names on the petition goes out asking that others sign, was Dr. Alexander Michael John, Berkeley, California, but prior to that, very prominent in the administration of an institution of higher learning in the Boston area. Now, do you want to hear some 199 names rattled off in a hurry in your own community who wanted two communists out of jail, or do you want me to skip this? John C. Bolins, Peace Educational Secretary, American Friends Service Committee, New England, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Mrs. Elizabeth Bowden, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Grenville Clark, lawyer and author, Dublin, New Hampshire. Alfred Sprague Coolidge, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Mrs. John O. Crane, Juniper Point, Woods Hole, Massachusetts. And then some 9 others on her that committee, Mr. and Mrs. Crane's committee. Dr. Jerome Davis, formerly of Yale Divinity, who seemed to have been separated over there, something to do with his alleged communist affiliations. He has a record in our book, the Episcopal book, and also in the Educator book, longer than Joe Stalin's left arm, more than 6 pages. Reverend Gardner M. Day, President of Civil Liberties Union, Cambridge, Massachusetts. And all he wants is two communists out of jail. Lucille Denham, co-leader, Fund of the Families, Falmouth, Massachusetts. You must excuse my language problem. I can't pronounce these long A's beautifully like you do up here. And I don't know how to say Cuba without looking to the text. So I'll have to say Cuba. Then you have Carl Dreyfus, Urban League of Greater Boston, an insurance broker, Boston, Massachusetts, according to their own petition. We have Dr. Alice Hamilton, Professor Emeritus, Medicine at Harvard University. William Roger Greeley, Trustee of Boston University, Massachusetts Civil Liberties Union, American Unitarian Association, Boston. Dr. Howard Mumford Jones and Mrs. Howard Mumford Jones. Florence H. Luscombe, member of the Advisory Committee of the Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts at Cambridge. Ex-Congressman William H. Meyer of Vermont. The petition said they want the president to release these two men from the federal penitentiary, identified communists. Dr. Sumner Rosen of the research section of the AFL-CIO Boston. Honorable Richard B. Scandrett, Jr., Trustee of Amherst College. Mrs. William A. Shercliffe, Board of the Civil Liberties Union at Cambridge, of the Massachusetts Board. Alan Sid, past president of Community Church of Boston at Brookline, Massachusetts. Milton Stanzler, Rhode Island Civil Liberties Union, Providence. Evangeline Wilcox, former field secretary of the YMCA at Putnam, Connecticut. Rabbi Samuel M. Silver at Temple Sinai at Stamford, Connecticut. Right Reverend Malcolm Peabody, East Cambridge, formerly Bishop of Central New York. Dean Walter G. Mueller, Boston University School of Theology. The dean has quite a list connected with his name in addition to this, I assure you. Dr. L. Harold D. Wolf, Boston University. Norman Gothwald, Andover Newton Theological School. Dr. Paul Tillich, Harvard University. Professor Burton H. Throckmorton, Bangor Theological Seminary, Bangor, Maine. Reverend John Crocker, chaplain of Brown University at Providence. The Reverend Joseph Fletcher. Joe Fletcher has a record longer than both of Stalin's arms. At the Episcopal Theological School, Cambridge. And incidentally, some 3 years ago, we checked the list of faculty at the Harvard and Yale Divinity Schools, and one had 27% and the other 33% of the faculty persons whose names had appeared in these causes, communist, pro-communist, and the categories I read. Quite an interesting impact upon students. Max F. Abel, chairman of the Social Action Committee of the Congregational Christian Conference at Durham, New Hampshire. Reverend William A. Johnson, professor of religion at Hartford, Connecticut. Reverend Dean Starr, chairman of the Social Action Committee of the Massachusetts Universalist Convention. Reverend Clinton Bromley, Methodist at Stoughton, Massachusetts. Reverend Arthur Amrain at Mothersfield, Connecticut. Reverend Gilbert Avery at St. John's Episcopal Church, Roxbury, Massachusetts. Rector Emeritus Walcott Cutler, St. John's Episcopal Church, Charleston, Boston, Massachusetts, apparently a resident of Cambridge now. Reverend James M. Bush of the AME Church at Dalton, Massachusetts. Reverend Benson Heelan Harvey, St. Philip's Episcopal Church at East Hampton. Reverend John L. Ivey at Melrose, Massachusetts, a Methodist preacher, retired. Reverend Arthur B. Jellis, First Parish in Concord, Massachusetts. Reverend John Paul Jones, D.D., I think it means dud, Presbyterian clergyman, Ashfield, Massachusetts. Reverend Jones has a terrific record. Reverend Andrew B. Jones, All Saints Episcopal Church at Belmont. Reverend Payson Miller, the First Union Congregational Church Society at Hartford, Connecticut. Edmund C. Berkeley, editor of the Computers and Automation, a magazine in Boston. Kay Boyle, author at Royton, Connecticut. Van Wyck Brooks, writer at Bridgewater, Connecticut. Reverend Arnold Thaw, minister of the Unitarian Church at Natick, Massachusetts. Reverend Joseph Thompson of the Cabani Methodist Church. Reverend Ralph Tucker of New Bedford, Massachusetts. Reverend Willard Uphouse, the great saint, at New Haven, Connecticut. Reverend Max H. Webster, Burlington, Vermont. Reverend Elliot White, Arlington, Massachusetts, a man with a serious record. Reverend Alfred Winham, Holyoke, Massachusetts. Reverend Lloyd F. Worley, at Hartford, Connecticut, past president and a patron saint of the Communist-Cited Methodist Federation for Social Action. Reverend Bradford Young at Manchester, New Hampshire. Mary Roberts Miggs, an artist at Cape Cod. Mrs. Clarence Day at Truro, Massachusetts. Mrs. Anna F. Eskridge, a librarian at Boston, Massachusetts. Frank Eskrigge, E-S-K-R-I-G-G-E, an architect in Boston. William Harrison, an editor, Boston, Massachusetts. Waldo Frank, the author. That is only 85. I think we'd better quit, or shall we go on? Huh? I think that's enough names. I'll tell you how to get one for $5. Subscribe to our mailing service, and we'll include one free. We will reproduce this photographically, the 2,200 names. And let me end this by saying that there were 2,200 such names in the United States, and your immediate area here provided over 200 of the names. Now a little more about education. A first grade reader in many schools says that Bobby was a lazy squirrel. He wouldn't gather nuts. Cold weather came, they got hungry. He saw a red bird go to a White House and a nut would roll out, but he could never get one. So he sat there at the White House. No nut came out, not even the manager. And then he churred and a nut rolled out. And the story ends, little Bobby said, and I learned all I have to do is ask for it. First grade reader in the first 9 states that I have checked the list of books authorized first grade readers. Hurriedly, I should like to have you make a note. If you are a police officer, a sheriff, if you are an employee of Uncle Sam or any kind of intelligence work, will you take a good look around the area for Students for a Democratic Society? The student branch, student department of the League for Industrial Democracy, it is worthy of your observation, as is the National Student Association, which it is trying to do a great deal with, and many other organizations. I would urge that you make a good close study of the Students for a Democratic Society. Now, many of you have asked, when will there be 6,000 Educators Volume 2? Here are the records, a carbon copy, of the records of more than 500 college and university and theological seminary professors for Volume 2, whose last name begins with the letter M. I do not have time to read the Boston list, but each of these lines is a Boston area professor with a letter beginning with M, whose record is in this new volume. How many minutes do I have? We have 5 more minutes. I don't know what to do with it other than to sit down, but I think we'd better use it. The little pamphlet we mentioned a while ago, a government pamphlet of 1944 about National Citizens Political Action Committee. It's interesting that in addition to these several Boston persons whose names I read, who are members of this 144-member committee, that the member of the composite committees which produced the Standard Revised Version of the Bible, with the greatest number of pro-communist and commie-frontians connected with his name, was W. Russell Bowie, Professor, Union Theological Seminary, New York City. We are not saying that these 30 of the 95 men deliberately did anything dishonest. I think they made an honest interpretation, translation. But if you are a non-believer and a word has 2 possible meanings, you would be dishonest if you gave the true Christian meaning of that word instead of the other meaning, which might not be so good. So I will say that I think they gave the honest meanings. Now, the attention that this meeting got from a critical point of view causes me to raise this question. How many of you read in a Boston paper that criticized this meeting so severely that Hunter Pitts Odell was exposed 6 weeks ago as the number 1 man under Martin Luther King in the southeastern portion of the United States in the Martin Luther King movement? How many read that in a Boston paper? I guess you didn't. It wasn't there. Hunter Pitts Odell was an identified communist with 2 hearings, 1950, Only 3 papers in the United States that I know of carried the story that Hunter Pitts Odell had been exposed as the number 2 man in the Martin Luther King movement. If an identified ex-communist or an identified communist had infiltrated and become the number 1 man in a birch society, they'd run special editions, 24-hour days for 3 months. It's an interesting thing as to what has happened to the news media in the United States. Most of these gentlemen would like to have facts rather than opinions. And we have now a project of sending subscriptions to some portion of 10,000 editors. Those of you who want to know more specifically about what has happened and who did it, witting or unwittingly, we recommend our book, 658 National Council of Churches, Personalities, and Their Records. 6,000 Educators, Volume 1. We make reference here to almost 3,000 educators. 20.5% or 1,411 Protestant Episcopal rectors, 660 Baptist clergymen, 2,109 Methodist ministers, 614 Presbyterian ministers, and those books are available through orders that you might place over in the book room, whatever it is over here in the corner. And those of you who subscribe to our mailing service today will get the petition free that I was talking about and the dollar book showing the records and the names of those National Council of Churches persons who apparently call for the recognition of communist Red China. And in your first mailing you get this package of exhibits, documents, photographs, reproductions of these various things that we've been establishing here today, copies of the original through photographic process. In order that when you talk to somebody in your PTA or in your sewing circle or at your cocktail party or your church meeting, your union meeting or your bankers meeting, instead of starting a lot of your opinions, you can say, John or George or Mary, here is an exhibit showing that this Methodist bishop sponsored a reception in the residence of Sammy Davis Jr. for James A. Dombrowski, the executive director, and Bishop Edgar A. Love of Baltimore, the president and executive director of the Southern Conference Educational Fund, the biggest and first communist penetration of the South by the communist apparatus. And on the back of it is the Senate Internal Security Committee's citation pointing out that it is a communist apparatus. There is too much to say now, excepting I would like to clear one thing. There are few persons who can learn more about the truth than the journalists and the reporters. They can learn many things that the police and governmental experts cannot learn, because some people will talk with them in confidence but be afraid to talk with government persons. There is more information available from your government and some of the private patriotic societies and sources than you could read in the rest of your lifetime. Your government has printed bound volumes on hearings in communism longer than from here to the wall. I have a set of each of these hearings. I would like to correct the impression that was created by persons wittingly or unwittingly quoting or repeating out of context the remarks of Assistant Director William C. Sullivan of the FBI. Mr. Sullivan said that the communist apparatus had never acquired dominant or effective control at the national level of any denomination. We concur with that 100% and go one step further and say that in our books, we give you their names. Mr. Sullivan's statement is correct. It is one of the most abused excerptings to smear the right wing that has happened in the last year or two. With that, I want to tell you how to save your country Please continue to pray, but also to remember that the communists are not 8 feet tall. Most of them are runts. Physically, you seldom see a big one, physically. They are like water bugs and cockroaches. You turn the light on them and they can't work. You've ruined their effectiveness. How good is a termite when he gets out of the woodwork? He just doesn't get much done. You needn't abuse any person. If he has created a record of communist or pro-communist support, and you publicize that record, if that's a good thing to do, you'll make a hero out of him. And I would say that if you will reduce your observation and attributing motive, and will limit most of your conduct in anti-communism to showing who did what, this room today would have been the scene of the beginning of one of the most effective anti-communist gestures of this century. This is a wonderful country. This is a wonderful way of life. And I hope that if you're doing all you can do to save it, that you'll do a little bit more and rededicate yourself to preserving for your children or your neighbor's children or your grandchildren this great freedom of choice system. And all I can say from here on, my folks, would be repetition in these few minutes, other than, O Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget that this is the greatest opportunity any large number of persons ever had in the history of the world, and lest we forget we're going to lose it unless we reverse the trend of our ideological and spiritual, moral and patriotic decadence. God bless America, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lowman. Mr. Lowman will himself be in the Georgian room for those who wish to discuss things further with him. And he will be very happy to try and answer questions that may be in your mind about anything he had to say.